Hello and welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host John Harney. Today we're looking at Battlefield 5, the latest entry in the wildly popular Battlefield series, a video game that typically has an historical setting or focus, particularly notably last year with World War I in Battlefield 1, but that typically has a multiplayer component that steals center stage. I'm coming at this, as always, as an historian, and so we're spending a lot of time on the single-player campaign elements of the game. First things first. This game's presentation is stellar. It's a long-running theme throughout History Respawned episodes, but historians tend to struggle making our work accessible to wider audiences. Say what you want about Battlefield 5, and I must say I'm not traditionally a big Battlefield player, but developer DICE has ramped up the presentation both in this game and its predecessor Battlefield 1, in what is only one of many parallels between the two games. Battlefield 5 really feels like a AAA game, shorthand for top-of-the-line, expensive productions built on the expectation of major sales to large audiences. This is no small thing. Battlefield 5's menus feel slick, its cutscenes have been produced with a clear cinematic eye, and the game oozes polish from start to finish. This game is well put together and produced entirely for you, the person playing this game, and as a result experiencing this history. I'm not really sure that historians need to start borrowing design decisions wholesale from major video games, but I do think we could learn something about what audiences are interested in playing, watching, and reading. Battlefield 5 is geared as a blockbuster game, and it makes no apologies for that. And when it works, I think it works very well, at the very least, in grabbing your attention. It is to the game's credit and my delight that history is at the core of this. Battlefield 5 focuses on World War II, a year after its predecessor Battlefield 1 covered World War I. The two wars have traditionally been treated very differently in popular discourse, something that Bob and his guest Chris Kempshall talked about in our episode on Battlefield 1. World War I, with its mythos of lions being led by donkeys and European nationalist bloodlust, has evolved in the popular memory into a large well of melancholy, the ultimate folly of an early 20th century and a late 19th century. Our visions and memory of World War II seem to be moving towards that direction now as well, especially in American discourses of Japanese-American internment and the horrors of the Pacific Theatre in particular. It's influenced also by the changing landscape of international relations, where post-war norms look like giving way to present-day American policy and continued distance from the pressures and ideological currents of the Cold War. Still, it will take some time. We are only now processing the passing of the greatest generation, as they have so often been called. The recent passing of Senator John McCain and President George H.W. Bush has been seen in the United States as the book finally being closed on an era of soldier statesmen. Those statesmen had of course soldiered, in one way or another, in World War II. More recent American presidents share the rather less easily ideologized act of dodging the draft rather than entering service, decisions muddied by the far more complicated feelings in the US towards the American war in Vietnam. Battlefield 5 in many respects performs as a bellwether of this broader cultural transition. Its single-player campaign, traditionally an afterthought in the series for many Battlefield players, has real narrative heft and clear historical goals. The four main stories cover a British Special Forces mission in Crete, the Norwegian resistance, Senegalese tirailleurs fighting in southern France, and a German tank crew trying to hold out against the inevitable Allied advance of early 1945. As I record this at the end of 2018, there are a lot of reasons in our popular discourse to look at previously neglected storylines in all manner of media and narratives. In this case, this impulse coincides happily with, frankly, better history. Sure, there are plenty of good reasons Western depictions of World War II focus on the Normandy landings again and again and again. When Bob covered Call of Duty World War II, this predilection came up and particularly bothered him. World War II has engraved itself in the public memory in a very specific way, with bravery in the face of a genuine evil. As a result, we like to focus on daring do and heroism. This impulse can survive. Just look at the last two Wolfenstein games. But there are other stories that can be told. Battlefield 5 does not feature a plucky band of young Americans traipsing through northwest France with at least one guy called Tex or something similar. Its stories focus on heroism, though often at a price. DICE deserves a huge amount of credit in my view. Choosing to focus on these storylines was not the easy choice and had plenty of pitfalls, not least of which would be a form of tone-deaf tokenism. However, the game's writers have successfully cottoned on to something very simple, and something that historians have known for a while and need to be a part of popularising. There are a lot of cool stories, dramatic stories, heartbreaking stories, moving stories, coming out of World War II. Take for example Tirailleurs, the story of Senegalese soldiers brought back to France to help with pushing back the Nazis. It is for my money the most successful of the 4 stories, and I cannot recommend highly enough Xalavier Nelson Jr.'s piece on this on Rock Paper Shotgun. Link is in the description, though please be aware there are spoilers. As Nelson points out, this episode does not hit you over the head with clumsy examples of racism. When Deme, our protagonist, has his rifle taken away and is instead handed a shovel, it doesn't take much for the audience to figure out what is happening here, and not much more needs to be said beyond that. Deme has come to France to fight for France. He gets to, in the end. He and his brother Idrissa are great characters, something this game gets right for the most part. In Tirailleurs, Deme and Idrissa get big heroic moments and big action set pieces. The question might come up, are we losing something by drifting away from some of the more typical World War II stories? I don't think so. We still get plenty of daring do. Under No Flag, featuring the utterly unself-consciously named Billy Bridger, is effectively a Dirty Dozen-style tale told as a growing relationship between 2 soldiers. Billy starts the story in jail and ends it a better man. Nothing terribly avant-garde here, but it's effective and it's fun to play. Whereas these 2 episodes get a lot of mileage and mix things up a little, fighting against the Nazis in France but as a Senegalese soldier, drafted out of prison to join Special Ops but in Crete, the remaining 2 stories, Nordlies and The Last Tiger, are a little different. Norway struggles somewhat to find a place in more traditional World War II narratives. The Scandinavian country attempted to remain neutral in the war, but was occupied by the Wehrmacht in April of 1940 and was unprepared for the German Blitzkrieg attack. Norway's relations with Britain in the preceding months had been somewhat complicated. Norway was intended to perform as part of a blockade on Germany, and the failure for that reality to materialise has coloured a lot of popular discussions of Norway's involvement in the war. Indeed, many European schoolchildren, of whom I was once one, learn mostly about Vidkun Quisling, the Norwegian fascist who declared himself Prime Minister on the day of the Nazi invasion and proceeded to rule over a puppet government, and who gave his name to the noun in English language meaning traitor. Just by acknowledging the existence and agency of the Norwegian resistance, Battlefield 5 makes a real contribution to popular memory of the war. After all, we've been engaged in exactly this with the French resistance for decades. The Last Tiger, meanwhile, focuses on the futility of the German position in the dying months of the war. I'll be honest, it can be a bit much. The single-player stories are going for a common emotional theme, and it can become a little cloying. At the same time, The Last Tiger is an important part of this story. Müller, the captain of the tank unit, was probably my favourite character in the game, though it was a close-run thing. The futility of his efforts and his doggedness in seeing things out to the end rang true to me. What other choice did he really have? It's ultimately this narrative force that drives the single-player portion of the game. It says a lot about where we are in 2018, I think, but then the more traditional narrative said a lot about where we were in the 1950s or 1980s. It's intriguing and exciting to see a huge popular conversation shift in new directions. These things take time, and it's really interesting to see the changes as they occur. And what about the multiplayer? Well, I'm not sure what to tell you. I die a lot in Battlefield multiplayer. A lot. The single-player campaign gives us a lot to think about, but the multiplayer portion of games like this get historians invested in video games pretty excited. Simply to function as a game, narrative has to disappear. Instead, you're located squarely in localized conflict, defined largely by shooter mechanics. Battlefield games are built with the multiplayer first and foremost, and I can't help but feel that has a major influence on the single-player campaigns DICE has been writing in recent years. By its very nature, this game defies singular viewpoints. You will have to play as an Axis soldier, even if that difference may appear mostly superficial, and if the game, wisely in my view, avoids Nazi imagery. I think this gives the game a lot of freedom in its approach, and that we've seen that in the single-player portions. It also renders complaints about women being playable in the game as competence, and similar complaints, moot. This game will play with history. That's kind of a big feature of what the Battlefield series does. You get in there as a player, and you're now actively changing that narrative, even if it just means, winning a certain battle that wasn't won otherwise, or something like that. I was impressed with how Battlefield 5 plays with history in the single-player stories, though. I don't think representation for its own sake automatically leads to good storytelling or good history. Looking at who you want your characters to be, what drives them and how they change, well, that's just good storytelling. Historians don't have the luxury of manufacturing characters from thin air, but there are plenty of good ones who walked the earth. Maybe we can learn something from Battlefield 5's approach. Thank you for watching. History Respawned is only possible because of the support of our patrons, and I want to say a special thank you to all of them. If you are interested in supporting us, please consider visiting patreon.com/historyrespawned. You can also find us at our newly revised website, www.historyrespawn.com, which also features the History Respawn podcast. Thank you, and see you next time.